The quagga was a sepia-streaked, partially striped equid once native to South Africa. It roamed the dust-swept Karoo plains and thorn-belled scrub, its head and neck banded like a zebra, while its hindquarters faded to a tan, mule-like plain. In the 1800s, hunters and scientists described it as distinct from the mountain zebra and from Burchell's zebra. By the late 19th century, some catalogs listed it as Equus quagga quagga, while older field guides and museum registers sometimes treated it as a separate species. Its range included the Cape Colony and adjacent interior, the Karoo, the Eastern Cape region, and parts of what became the Orange Free State, where Boer farmers after the Great Trek, circa 1835 to 1846, and British colonists expanding from Cape Town encountered quagga herds. The golden age of colonial natural history brought a flood of men with guns, nets, and specimen tags. Frontier hunters seeking bounties and hides, Boer settlers clearing rangeland for sheep and cattle, and metropolitan naturalists cataloging specimens for the British Museum and for Natura Artis Magistra, the Amsterdam Zoo founded in 1838. Collecting practices were blunt and commercial. Skins, skulls, skeletons, and mounted trophies were crated and shipped to European cabinets of curiosity in London, Paris, and Amsterdam. Field notes often recorded precise shipment dates and provenance, leaving a ledger trail that later historians and museum curators could follow. That ledger trail raises two stark questions that anchor this story. Taxonomically, was the quagga a distinct species, or merely a southern, partly striped population of the plains zebra? And historically, how did colonial collecting, driven by market demand for curiosities, bounties, and expanding agricultural frontiers, accelerate a decline already visible by mid-century? Those questions stitch together biology, empire, and commerce, and set the stage for the coming chapters of extinction, preservation, and contested resurrection. By the 1850s, the quagga's world had been split by fences, flocks, and foreign appetites. Voortrekker settler families pushing inland after the Great Trek, circa 1835 to 1846, parceled Karoo commonage into sheep pastures around towns such as Graaf Reinet and Colesberg. They replaced seasonal, mixed grazing with compact fenced paddocks that denied quagga herds the wide-ranging movement they needed. British colonial expansion from Cape Town and Port Elizabeth accelerated land claims in the Eastern Cape and across the plains of the Orange Free State. Survey maps and land grant registers from the 1850s and 1860s show farm boundaries cropping up across former quagga ranges, and veldt reports from magistrates record the systematic conversion of caroid scrub to merino grazing. Livestock competition mattered. Boer and British cattle and sheep introduced trampling, overgrazing, and direct competition for the perennial grasses on which quaggas depended, shrinking viable habitat along the margins where they had persisted alongside human settlers. At the same time, hunting shifted from subsistence to commerce. Frontier hunters and colonial sportsmen supplied meat and hides to local markets, but increasingly sent skins and mounted specimens to meet metropolitan demand. Victorians prized exotic trophies. Natural history dealers and European museums in London, Paris, and Amsterdam issued purchase orders and accepted crates of skins, skulls, and articulated skeletons throughout the 1860s and 1870s. Natura Artis Magistra in Amsterdam, the British Museum Natural History in London, and the Musée National d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris all acquired quagga material during this period. Museum accession ledgers and shipping manifests even record provenance down to farm names and shipment dates. That paper trail shows how scientific curiosity and fashionable collecting turned local declines into a market-driven crisis. Maybe clicking subscribe would have saved them. Collectors wrote field labels that mattered: place of origin, date of kill, and the hunter's name. Those details now allow historians to map the shrinkage of quagga range year by year. Taxidermists profited, private collectors and provincial museums drove demand, and colonial outlets exported dozens of specimens rather than supporting any conservation. Predation and drought mattered too, but commerce proved decisive. Every skin sold made another animal a target. By the 1870s, killing had become routine rather than exceptional, and surviving quagga populations were fragmented into isolated pockets between farms and fences. That fragmentation funneled animals toward a new fate: transport to European menageries and zoos, setting the stage for captive histories and the eventual death in Amsterdam in 1883 that would make the quagga a symbol of loss and a flashpoint for later debates about resurrection. By the time quagga numbers were collapsing, the debate over what a quagga actually was had moved from Veld journals into the cabinets and catalogues of London, Paris, and Amsterdam. Curators at the British Museum, Natural History, under John Edward Gray, at the Musée National d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris, and at Natura Artis Magistra in Amsterdam, treated a handful of preserved skins, skulls, and skeletons as de facto standards. Often boxed with consignor names, farm provenance, and shipment dates, these museum pieces became the benchmarks by which new field reports were judged. William John Burchell's earlier travels and specimen lists supplied comparative material for 19th century naturalists, but by the 1850s and 1860s, opinions hardened. Some zoologists argued the quagga deserved species status, pointing to its faded hindquarters and distinctive striping on the head and neck as stable characters. Others insisted the animal fell within the variation of the plain zebra, Equus burchelli, or what later catalogues rendered as Equus quagga. That taxonomic tug-of-war mattered beyond names because museum judgments directly shaped market demand. Dealers in London and Amsterdam advertised true quagga skins at premium prices, and collectors paid more for mounts carrying a museum accession number or a hunter's signature on the field label. The same accession ledgers that now allow historians to map decline also functioned at the time as provenance proofs, turning scarce animals into prized inventory. Preservation practices further skewed interpretation. Tanning, bleaching, and display mounting altered pelage tones, so a faded hide from a drought year specimen could be cited as diagnostic evidence of a distinct taxon. Taxonomic monographs and zoo catalogues reproduced those museum specimens in engravings and plates that circulated across Europe, fixing certain appearances as canonical. Meanwhile, museums actively solicited live animals. Menageries in Amsterdam and London negotiated with agents and boar collectors, offering cash that incentivized more hunting and capture. By the 1870s, the network of naturalists, taxidermists, dealers, and curators had created a feedback loop in which scientific authority and commercial value reinforced one another. The fewer authentic quagga specimens in European cabinets, the more valuable each became, and the greater the pressure to supply them from the Cape Colony. That consolidation of the quagga's identity inside museum walls set the stage for the next act. The removal of remaining individuals from their shrinking veld, their shipment to European menageries, and the harsh reality of captive care
for an animal already deprived of the ecological space needed to recover.
Imagine the transfer from veld to menagerie. It was mechanical and implacable. Hunters and middlemen in the Cape Colony crated animals with hastily nailed planks, affixed leather field labels with farm names and kill dates, and consigned them to coastal agents in Cape Town who booked passage on packet ships bound for Europe. Those shipping manifests and the artist's accession ledgers, written in sepia ink and block hand, recorded consignors, crate dimensions, and shipment dates, and together they traced the quagga's final movements from Karoo homestead to Amsterdam exhibit. Live animals endured cramped journeys, made worse by ignorance of equid diets and by diarrhea triggered by sudden change. Keepers reported animals listless after weeks at sea. They arrived at European docks with ruffled manes, faded hides, and an exaggerated vulnerability. Zoos treated quaggas as showpieces. Catalog entries labeled them Equus quagga quagga, often called the true quagga. They were gelded or kept solitary for public display under gaslight and in the clipped, gravelled enclosures fashionable in mid-century menageries. Practical husbandry lagged behind spectacle. Diets were rudimentary hay and oats. Occasional carrots, and veterinarians in Amsterdam and London fretted over laminitis, parasitic burdens, and the stresses of captivity in correspondence now archived in artist files and the proceedings of European societies. Record-keeping that had once served as provenance and market proof became a logbook of decline. Arrival dates, veterinary interventions, dates of death, and the final disposition of skins and bones were all inked into permanent registers. By the late 1870s and early 1880s, the number of captive quaggas in European collections had thinned. Menageries exchanged specimens less as part of living breeding programs and more as trophies to fill gaps in comparative cabinets. In Amsterdam, Natura Artis Magistra's cage roster included a quagga whose accession entry survives. Keepers noted her origin as a Cape Colony farm and later annotated her diminishing vigor. On August 12, 1883, that individual died at Artis Royal Zoo. The curator's book records, Quagga, dead, August 12, 1883, Amsterdam. The death crystallized a dawning realization among zoologists and the public that a race of animal had been extinguished within a single colonial century. Private laments in hunters' letters and commercial dealer invoices became public notice in museum circulars and natural history journals. The quagga's demise transformed mournful bookkeeping into a catalyst for debate about human responsibility for species loss. The last quagga's pallid hide and numbered crate label survived as relics in European collections, mute evidence that commercial appetite, colonial expansion, and zoological display had conspired to end a sepia-streaked creature whose fate would haunt later conversations about recovery and restoration. On August 12, 1883, the last known quagga died at Natura Artis Magistra in Amsterdam. Keepers recorded the fatal entry in the curator's ledger as Quagga, dead, August 12, 1883, Amsterdam, and that single line set a rapid chain of actions in motion. Artis staff stabilized the pallid hide, prepared its skull and articulated skeleton, and entered accession details into the zoo register so the animal could serve both as relic and as a specimen. Within weeks, curators in London and Paris were consulting the Amsterdam entry to reconcile their own holdings. The British Museum, Natural History, and the Musée National d'Histoire Naturelle cross-checked shipment manifests, farmer names, and dealer invoices to verify provenance. Dutch newspapers and European natural history journals transformed ledger ink into public fact. Provincial Dutch presses and periodicals such as Nature and the Proceedings of the Zoological Society published notices and essays that treated the event as a continental story rather than a local curiosity. Scholars and administrators read the provenance trail with new eyes. Packet ship dates, hunter signatures, and farm names like Graf Reinet and Kohlsberg stitched the quagga's end to fences, merino flocks, and market demand in the Cape Colony. The numbered hide and museum label became incontrovertible evidence that collecting practices and colonial land use had not been neutral scientific acts, but active drivers of decline. Museum directors who had solicited specimens now found themselves curating proof of culpability, and private correspondence shifted from triumphant acquisition to public contrition. That immediate documented moral reckoning, inked into accession books, amplified in newspapers, and argued over in learned journals, elevated the quagga from a vanished local form to a continental emblem of human-caused loss, and it set the moral terms for later debates about recovery and de-extinction. The single Amsterdam ledger entry from August 12, 1883, did more than record a zoo specimen. The skins, skulls, and labels that ended up in European cabinets at Artis Zoo in Amsterdam, the Natural History Museum in London, and museums in Paris later became raw data for molecular researchers. Late 20th and early 21st century mitochondrial DNA studies on those museum hides reframed the quagga not as a distinct species, but as a southern, partly striped population within the plains zebra lineage. That finding upended long-standing taxonomic certainty and forced curators to confront how collecting priorities shaped scientific narratives. That reassessment led to practical action. In 1987, Reinhold Rau launched the Quagga Project in South Africa, a selective breeding back effort using plains zebras to recreate quagga-like appearances for ecological and educational restoration. The project and the debates it sparked helped launch modern de-extinction conversations about ancient DNA, cloning, and ecosystem repair, and exposed hard lessons about colonial collecting. Museums had assembled specimens under unequal power dynamics and then wrote extinction stories from metropolitan vantage points. Today, those institutions are being asked to reckon with provenance, repatriation, and collaborative decision-making with South African stakeholders and descendant communities. The Quagga story is a cautionary blueprint. Scientific tools can recreate appearances, but ethical authority, who decides what to restore, why, and for whom, remains the central, unresolved question.